Hi guys. I'll just wait for 5 p.m. But yeah, you can see the presentation down there. Am I audible? Hopefully, I'm audible. So yeah, if you just logged on, the link to the presentation is down below. So yeah, we'll start in a minute. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about adjudication. So adjudication is very important in the debating community. Without adjudication, our tournaments won't function. And a lot of times, people pay more attention to debating than adjudication. So it's important that in today's lecture, I'm going to walk you through the adjudication process from the moment the debate starts to the delivery of the oral adjudication. I'm going to explain how you avoid the common pitfalls, but also explain the theory behind it and hopefully how you're going to execute it later on. So if you look at the first slide, you'll see the general flow. I'm going to first talk about what the role of an adjudicator is because it's important that we set some expectations. The second thing we're going to talk about is I'm going to discuss the three tasks of an adjudicator. Firstly, is to listen. Secondly, is to decide. And thirdly, it's to deliver an oral adjudication. I'm also going to talk about some special scenarios in adjudication, such as how do you score on a ballot, what do you do if you're a panelist, what do you do if you're a dissenter, and what if there's a definitional challenge in the debate. All these particular unique circumstances are things I'm going to be discussing in my lecture. So let's start. What is the role of an adjudicator in the debate? So basically, you have three roles. Firstly, is you're the judge. Obviously, you are deciding who wins the debate. You are deciding who wins that particular championship. You are deciding who wins this round based on the arguments that you're voting. So you're not just judging the debate in particular. You are also a member of the jury. So in Asians, you're and create the consensus of who wins or who loses the round. Lastly, is sometimes you're the executioner. The reality is debate judges have a very powerful role in bubble rooms, in break rounds, in championships. You basically decide and evaluate whether or not debaters' dreams live or die. So that's kind of a huge responsibility and huge power. So it's important to necessarily make sure that you do the job well. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there is a power check towards judging. Um, because insofar as judges have all the power in deciding who wins, who loses, there's also a check and balance towards adjudicators. In this particular case, it's adjudicator feedback. So you aren't necessarily being graded on the accuracy of the decision because we know debaters are very emotional. So it's not just the accuracy, but it's also your credibility and how they feel you acknowledge their contribution. So a lot of oral adjudication is a balance between not just making the right decision, but delivering the right decision in a way that makes the debaters appreciate that you gave the right decision. Because most of the times, especially in bubble rooms, you might get low scores simply because you made them lose. So it's important to make sure that you possess that aura of authority, that aura of being fair, and of course be clear, because the worst they grade us back, creates a system where the relationship between judges and debaters is something that's more of a peer relationship, because essentially you should be peers in the debate community. But in this case, you're taking an impartial but also important role. So, what are the ADJ expectations? Oh, I see all of your comments. Hello. Um, the ADJ expectations, the most common one you'll hear is an average reasonable person. I know that in some circuits they've evolved this to an average intelligible voter. But essentially, what this means is you aren't a specialist. You're essentially a college level student. You're knowledgeable of current events. So you know who Obama is, you know who the current president of the US is, which is Trump. You know particular events that are occurring, like you have the COVID-19 pandemic. Basically, you read headlines, but more importantly, you have intact logic. So the term logic, it varies depending on the quality of the round. Obviously, in higher rounds, you'll be much more strict, and you'll require more sophisticated analysis for things to fly. But in lower rounds, or in rounds where you have novices or beginners who might not be as sophisticated in their analysis, logic might just be, it might not necessarily be true in the real world, but if it's logical, it's something you'll have to credit. But more importantly, judges need to be an expert in the debate rules. So my recommendation is to look at the WUDC judging manual, because as of the moment, it's the most central authoritative document of all judging rules. And also, if you're looking for Asians, I think UADC Bandung Adjudication Corps, that was in 2019 or 2018, they also issued a document. And lastly, you need to believe in quality debating and justice, because adjudicators were the gatekeepers of who progresses and who doesn't progress, so it's important to do that. So what are the tasks of an adjudicator? Primarily, there are three tasks to an adjudicator. First is you need to listen. Second is you need to decide. And thirdly is you need to deliver. So let's talk about the first task. Am I going too fast? Can you guys tell me if I'm going too fast in the comments? Okay. The first task is listening. So you'll see in the PowerPoint that in terms of listening, what you want is you want to be a sponge, but you want to be an active sponge. So you want to be impartial and absorb everything they're saying, but you also need to actively critique it in your head. So it's important because the basis of your decision will be what you heard. So if you don't listen well, you're gonna have a tough road ahead of you. It's important to stay awake. I know sometimes when there are 4 rounds in a day, or hate like judges who sleep, obviously. So it's your duty to listen. It's not optional. You need to listen. Even if you think that you might know where the argument is heading, it's important that you listen, because debaters oftentimes can surprise you. So there's a twofold function to taking down notes. Obviously, there's some judges who don't need to take down notes, like they're very old alumni and even new beginners who feel that it's more important for them to listen than to take down notes. If you can do that, then that's fine. You're amazing. But in general, most adjudicators will want to take down notes for 2 reasons. Firstly is it's a memory aid. So especially in Asians debates, where the issues become a lot deeper, it's important to recognize what everyone says. So it's important to make sure that you take down notes. Especially it's something you can review, especially in close debates, whether it's AP or BP, you need to have notes as a memory aid. But the other tool is it's somewhat like a prop, because it signals to the debaters that you are listening, that you are taking down notes. It increases your perceived credibility. But obviously, that's just extraneous to the case there are disagreements in the panel. But obviously, in Asians, you just decide and vote. So things to remember. Firstly is when you write down notes, make sure, of judges, is that they try to transcribe the entire round word for word. And that's wrong because firstly, it's going to consume your time. Secondly, sometimes when you're fixated on writing notes instead of listening, you aren't catching or absorbing the impact of the argument. The way that you're listening is that after every speech, you're already determining who's winning. So after the first exchange, who is winning at this particular point? It's a common misconception that you only decide the debate at the end of the round. You need to be actively thinking and actively weighing everything. So don't transcribe, just write bullet points or write pertinent points of information that you might need to recall the argument later. Some debaters, they write questions and comments. It's really up to you. The content varies. The important thing is, one, you need to keep it organized, and two, you need to keep it understandable. Even if your handwriting sucks, even if no one else can understand it, like if you ever seen me judge, I have circles everywhere. It's fine as long as you can understand your own handwriting and you can understand your notes. Then it's fine. So if you're a debater, what you'll take from this is you need to be easy to follow. You need to be organized. So essentially, for the first task, it's quite straightforward. You want to have the mindset of an average reasonable person. You want to be actively thinking within the round, and you want to, as much as possible, listen and take down notes, because notes are your best friend. Notes will help you later. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a firm grasp of what the debate is, you won't be able to decide which is the next stage, and probably the one of the harder stages of adjudication. So the second part is decision making. So how do you decide? The first thing is, if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see like a process. So the first thing you want to do is you look at your gut call. So a gut call is, after the round ends, who do you feel won the debate? Who really won the debate? Since you were actively thinking throughout the round, you should have a good call. And then after that, what you want to do is you want to review your notes. So after you've established a good call, let's say for me, government was quite strong, a lot of opposition's responses failed, government won, then I would look over my notes and look at opposition's contribution relative to governments and see if did gov really won. From there, you affirm or reject your gut call. Sometimes, especially when teams are bottom heavy or they have really strong whips or really strong reply speeches, you might be inclined, your gut call might not necessarily be the right call. So it's always important to review your notes to make sure that you aren't disregarding or not crediting previous contributions towards the start of the debate. It's very important to holistically look at the debate to be able to help you in this reviewing process, because obviously the gut call, you're going to have a gut call after a debate. You're going to have some inkling of who won or who didn't win, unless it's a really close debate. In that case, the reviewing stage is important. What you want to do is you want to map out the debate. So in judging Asians, it's important to, one, identify the central question of the debate. Then you need to look at issues. In issues, you sometimes need to look if there are sub-issues, but more importantly, whether teams had explanations for why one issue would be more important than the other. Because you will sometimes have debates where teams only focus on their issue and there's very little engagement. So in those cases, we need to look at the importance of issues. And it's not a numbers game. Just because one side wins two issues doesn't mean they automatically win. At the end of the day, you always look at, do they win a particular issue, and were they able to show why that issue was central to winning the debate. So what I'd like to do is, in BP and in Asians, is I have a piece of paper, and while I have a separate piece of paper trying to write down notes on each speaker, I also have bullets of the general gist or a bird's eye view of what everyone else is talking about in the debate. That way I can map out the debate. So I have issue 1, what is Gov saying, what is Op saying, issue 2, what is Gov saying, what is Op saying. So in deciding a debate, and this is probably the most important part, aside from how to give an oral adjudication, you need to use standards. So I'm going to be now discussing standards, because you can't just decide based on arbitrary things. You can't decide based on which team has the cutest speakers. You can't decide based on, was a team under time? Did a team have more fluent English? These are not standards. These are horrible standards to decide a debate. So the first standard is contribution. It's perhaps the most important. You need to examine the arguments and rebuttals of each speaker. And you basically ask two questions, two fundamental questions. Firstly, is the statement true? And secondly, is the statement relevant? Because at the end of the day, all arguments need to be assessed on whether or not they proved it, but also whether or not they are relevant to the motion at hand or to the issue. So from there, you also look at responses, because unlike declamation or extemporaneous speaking, debating is dual in nature, in the sense that you respond to each other. So you also need to look at, was there a response to this argument? And the other thing you need to look at is, was the argument able to survive that response? So in contribution, what you're looking for is, firstly, is it true? You look at, do they have grounding? Do they have examples? Do they have proof? Do they have hypothetical examples? Did they explain the logic, which is another standard we'll be discussing later? That's what you look at when you ask the question, is it true? In the question, is it relevant? You look at, how do they tie it back to the motion? Do they explain why getting this benefit or this harm or this value or this policy justifies the motion at hand? Those are the kinds of things you need to look at. That's more towards the conclusiveness of the arguments of the debater. Or even if they didn't conclude it intuitively, does this make sense, or is this relevant to the debate at hand? Now, in assessing contribution and whether they survive particular responses, one thing you need to look at is the fact that I subscribe, and most of general debating communities subscribes to a non-interventionist philosophy, which means even if an argument is not responded to, that doesn't mean the argument stands. It still needs to pass the threshold or the litmus test of, even without any response, is the argument something that will persuade an average reasonable person? Basically, just because an argument is unresponded to doesn't mean it's allowed to stand. You still need to evaluate whether or not there was enough proof and enough analysis for why that argument was true and relevant. So that's basically something you need to do. Again, a lot of judging isn't looking at what they say and summarizing it. A lot of judging is evaluation. So you really need to evaluate and go beyond what they're saying in terms of not just summarizing what they say, but evaluating what they say relative to proving it and relative to winning that particular debate. So if you're a debater, what you do here is you need to keep track on who's winning what. Similarly, as a judge, you need to make sure that in terms of contribution, you look at the argument, you look at the rebuttal, and you look at the goal. Because essentially what the rebuttal tries to do is prove the converse of the argument, or show that the argument shouldn't stand in this particular debate. So if you're a new judge, I know this might be quite intimidating. I know that sometimes you're afraid to reject an argument and you just want to try to please everyone. What you just want to do is you will have to make a team lose, and you will have to decide. You can't make both teams win. Unfortunately, that's not how debate works. So you need to make sure that you assess the contribution based on truth and relevancy. So the next standard we're going to look at, if I'm too fast, please tell me, because I'm unsure what speed I'm going at. The next standard we want to look at is logic. So this is where we want to examine whether there's a clear progression from the premise to the conclusion. Are there logical gaps? Now, this is what in the Philippine community we call as operationalization. Oh, hello, Irvin Grana. Operationalization. So operationalization is, did the speaker explain how you go from step A to step B to step C? So in this case, you ask, is there a gap? But more importantly, whether or not the gap is significant, whether or not the gap is something that compromises your understanding of the argument. Please take note that all debaters are constrained by 7 minutes. All debaters do not have an infinite amount of time. So there are some things that obviously they cannot explain. So it's really just a test of, is the lack of analysis in this particular area preventing it from it being true? Or is the statement in itself something an average reasonable person would accept? This isn't an excuse for debaters not to provide analysis. It's more of there needs to be some level of consciousness on the part of the judge that a debater can't explain every single thing. For example, if it's a fact that's commonly accepted, like the sky is blue, there's no need for the debater, hypothetically, obviously no one's going to argue that, there's no need for the debater to explain the physics or how the light affects the spectrum and all these other things. So basically what you're looking for in this standard is logic. Is it logical? Because if there are significant gaps that makes it unpersuasive because that makes it seem like it's an assertion. Again, in debate, what we're trying to assess are arguments and responses. These are well crafted, these are proven. We're not listening to simply assertions. An assertion is basically um, rhetoric that doesn't have any proof behind it, or simply you're declaring that something is true without necessarily proving the process of why it's going to be true. So, given that particular level, the next standard we need to assess. So again, we're still in task 2, which is deciding. So I'm giving you all the standards and how to apply them in order for you to be able to assess who wins the debate and who loses the debate. So consistency. We need to look at the characterizations, the arguments, the rebuttals of each speaker, and you compare it to their teammates. Are there differences between the statements? If there are differences, are they large? And is the statement crucial to their stance? So one thing you need to one thing that most judges don't know is, especially in the Philippines, I think what we do in the Philippines, which is incorrect, is we still try to take both statements at face value, even if they're contradictory statements. That's wrong. The world's adjudication manual and the UADC adjudication manual is quite clear. It is simply unfair to the opposing team to credit both statements. What you're supposed to do is you only accept the first statement that is said and completely disregard the second statement. Contradictions and other violations of the rules don't merit an automatic loss. That's one of the golden rules of adjudication. There's no such thing as an automatic loss. What you want to do in that situation is simply remove the advantage. So in this case, the fact that they're trying to play two sides of the same issue or the same argument, two contradictory statements, the penalty is by disregarding the second statement, you are disregarding the time they use in order to argue that statement. So again, in contradictions, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to only credit the first statement, because if you credit the second statement or credit both statements, you're being unfair to other speakers of the opposing side that assumed that this was the value or this was the argument that this side of the house was going to argue. So again, in terms of consistency and resolving contradictions, always take the first statement, logic and consistency. This is where you need to be able to make a decision. Because at the end of the day, in deciding, you need to firstly identify the issues. And secondly, within those issues, you need to determine who wins those issues, who wins those particular points. So you look at consistency, you look at logic, but more importantly, you look at contribution. What was their contribution to this issue? And was it something substantive for them to necessarily win that particular issue or that sub-issue? So from there, you've decided. So at this point, if you have questions, by the way, feel free to comment them and I'll answer them later towards the end. So at this point, you've already decided who won the debate. How do you score? So this is a portion I'd like to focus on particularly because unfortunately, Philippine debating has a reputation of scoring debaters quite low. We're quite stingy with our points. And this is something I'd like to correct as much as possible. So the range traditionally that we're using now is 67 to 83. So let's try to clarify what these particular points mean. I know this is lengthy, especially if you're an experienced debater adjudicator, but I think it's important to refresh it and try to distinguish it for the benefit of the community. So the first thing is 67 to 70. These are very poor speakers in terms of their skill. It's evident that a lot of the content isn't relevant. 67 to 70 should seldomly be given because we assume that it's only seldomly that a speaker will come up and not give anything relevant. So common examples would be speakers that aren't speaking on the motion at all. Perhaps they just stood up there, they didn't speak. Perhaps they had a 2-minute speech and they just broke down. Basically 67 to 70 are for people who offer no content whatsoever that's relevant to the debate. Or sometimes a 67 to 70 speech might be a 7-minute speech, but both the speaker and the content is not only confusing, but it's also evident they're confused with what is occurring. 71 to 72 is the individuals who are hard to follow and hard to credit, and claims are occasionally relevant. So again, just because a speech is messy doesn't mean they're below average. There could be messy speakers who are above average speakers. What generally distinguishes those below 75 and above 75 is relevancy of arguments. Is there lines of analysis that can be acceptable to help you decide for or against the motion? So as a judge, in determining whether or not the person is above average or below average, the thing you need to look at is, was a lot of the content relevant or was it irrelevant? And you gradiate downward based on whether or not there were logical gaps. For example, a 73 to 74 speaker is a speaker who has arguments that are frequently relevant. So a lot of the speech is an attempt towards answering the motion. It's just that a lot of the arguments have huge logical gaps. So this is completely different from a 71 speaker who isn't really making arguments, and a lot of it is occasionally relevant. And the issue isn't gaps. The issue is most of the material isn't an argument, but it's a suggestion or statements that are suggestive of an argument. So 75 is the average. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of our scoring is low is because our average is quite high, or our expectation of what the average should be is quite high. And the most common description is there's an equal strengths or weaknesses, but that doesn't really tell you anything. So one thing I'd like to try to explain is in terms of what a 75 speech is. A 75 speech is all of the material addresses a core issue in the particular debate. It's just that the arguments are a bit simplistic or vulnerable to competent responses. So a 75 speech isn't necessarily something that's bad, but it isn't necessarily good either. It's good only in the sense that you're addressing core issues in the debate. Whether or not you're successful in doing so, perhaps you aren't successful because the 75 speaker tends to be quite simplistic. So there aren't huge logical gaps as a 73 speaker. There's logic there. It's just that the logic is a bit simplistic or has a lot of assumptions. So 76 to 77. So again, a lot of the time, people just give 75 or lower scores, even if people are average and above average. So it's really important to make sure that you give the correct scores. I'm not promoting inflation. We want to score correctly, because if you score too low, it's an injustice to debaters. If you score too high, it's also an injustice to debaters, because you're messing up the matchups, you're messing up which teams make the break and which teams don't. So as much as possible, we want to be accurate. So 76 to 77 is above average or slightly above average. So these are, whereas a 75 speaker might be a bit simplistic, a 76 to 77 speaker addresses the core issues quite well. So that's something we want to look at. So it's the level of analysis that differentiates 75 from 76 to 78 to 80. So 78 to 79 are clear strengths. They're quite compelling, no logical gaps. Now, the difference between a 78, 79 to an 80, 81, 82, 83 is how well the arguments are crafted. So largely a 78 to 79 will have compelling arguments, while 80, 81 to 83 will have well-made arguments that would require a lot of good and brilliant responses in order to take down. So I want to dispel the notion that we only give 80s to debate gods or people who change our lives, because I think that kind of rhetoric in ad briefings might have affected people from getting or breaching that particular level. Like, I think there was one nationals where it was pointed out that no one at their nationals even got a score higher than 79. So I think what you want to look at is 80, 81, 82, 83 is the speech is really good. It persuades, after that particular speech, you are gravitating towards their side because of the exceptional analysis. And perhaps the only limitation to the speech is the fact that it ended, the fact that they only had 7 minutes. So again, to get an 80 speech doesn't mean that you have to dramatically change that person's life, or you have to make the debate end at that particular point because there's no way to respond to it. It only means that the arguments are well crafted and it will require a lot of responses or a lot of brilliant responses in order to respond to those arguments or to respond to those things. Again, the difference between 78 to 79 and 80 to 81, 80 to 83 is while all of them engage the core debates, speakers who breach the scale of 80 to 83 are those who are not only successful in engaging the core issues, but they have well-crafted arguments. They're quite persuasive in every particular aspect. So again, that's how you want to do it. Again, a lot of judging can only be calibrated at the test debate. So if you're at a tournament that has a test debate, it's very important that you try to calibrate what the expectations of the ad score are towards how you should be grading. So that's basically how we resolve scoring. If you have questions, feel free to discuss that a bit later. So we're done with task one, which is listening. We're done with task two, which is deciding and even how to score ballot. We're now moving on to task three. So task three is delivering the decision. This is the part you're being graded on. This is the part that connects the judges to the debaters, because it doesn't really matter if your decision was the correct decision, because that alone won't get you acknowledgement from the debaters. You need to deliver it, because no matter how accurate your rationale is in your head, if you don't deliver it in a way that it goes across to the debaters, they're not going to give you a good score. This is what separates intermediate judges from great judges or judges that will win those adjudicator awards. It's perfect and good delivery of the decision. So the first thing you want to do is you want to be confident. If you sound nervous or if you sound unsure of your decision, then debaters aren't going to grade you well, and debaters aren't going to acknowledge you as well. Because why would I be convinced of your decision if you don't sound convinced of your decision? So you need to be confident. You need to acknowledge speakers' contributions, especially in BP and in Asians, as much as possible. You do not want to disregard everything. Obviously, especially in tournaments now that give you a limited time frame, you won't be able to cover every example, every line of analysis, but you need to somewhat thematically make it so that there's quite a lot of breadth in your adjudication that you're able to cover everything. So the main substance of the decision is acknowledging these points. So you can quote or paraphrase their ideas, especially if they have buzzwords, if they have particular handles or titles to their particular arguments. It's important to remember them because it'll show that you're listening. This is where you demonstrate that you've not only done task two, which is deciding, but also task one, which is listening. And this is not limited to good contributions as well. One popular method is the sandwich method, which is basically for every negative thing you say, you want to sandwich it with a compliment. Oftentimes, you say you appreciate the good things that they did, because debaters are sometimes quite sensitive. But also, you want to separate constructive criticism. One of the mistakes of new judges is they give their speaker comments or they give their suggestions in their oral adjudication. While that might be helpful, it's important to separate because we don't want it to come across like you're stepping into the debate. But also, you want to make sure that you also, even in higher rooms or top rooms, sometimes judges are afraid of giving, calling out that not all contribution was good. I think it's important because it shows the debaters that you really know what you're doing and you really were listening in the round. Because if you're just accepting everything they say and not recognizing the fact that they did have some flaws, then it's likely that your credibility is going to go down. So what is my template for success? So perhaps if you're going to take anything away from this adjudication, it's this. My template for success is the first part of the oral adjudication. You can give speaker comments. It really depends on you. But a large part of it will be discussing the issues. So in Asians in particular, what you want to do is you want to follow a process where you give the argument, you evaluate the argument, and you designate credit to the argument. So the reason why most judges don't break is because they focus on the first part, which is they look at the argument alone. These are judges who parrot. Parroting is you're just repeating the argument. Judges are not parrots. They're not supposed to repeat the argument. or just give a summary of the debate, because debaters were in the debate. They knew what happened in the debate. They don't need a summary or an oral transcription of what occurred in the debate. So don't parrot. Not debaters, but judges are also not whips. So don't sound like you're a whip for one side or the other. As much as possible, in the same way you're confident, you want to sound impartial, or you want to sound like you have the authority of judging this particular debate. So a lot of judges waste so much time in the first part, which is simply summarizing what occurred in the debate. But most of what debaters are looking for is the second segment and the third segment, which is evaluation and credit. You need to evaluate the argument. You want to take the debaters through your head and explain your mental process for how you weighed particular arguments and how you appreciated or didn't appreciate a particular argument. So what does this look like? It looks like this was your argument. I found this compelling because, and then you explain why you found it compelling. Or this was your argument, and although I understand your conclusion, obviously you aren't being vague like this. It's obviously going to depend on what happened in the debate. Don't be generic as well. We don't want the judges who are generic or vague. Judges who say you won based on responsiveness, you won based on depth of contribution. Like, they want you to be specific on what line of analysis occurs. So it's a fine line between, or it's a balancing act between being comprehensive, but also being detailed enough so that you aren't generic or vague. So what you do in evaluation, so you point out the argument. If you're appreciating it, or if you found it compelling, explain why. Then you take into consideration either A, the lack of response from the other side, or B, the response and why you found the response not compelling. So this is where a key thing, especially in trying to decide issues or show why one issue went to another, is what was the gap. In an oral adjudication, the way you want to come across is the debaters lost because of their shortcomings. The debaters lost because there was a crucial piece of analysis, or there was an analysis that was missing from them, or it's just that the other team had significantly more persuasive analysis. At the end of the day, in your oral adjudication, it needs to sound less like you were the one, like your personal values affected the decision. What you want it to come across as is it was their lack of analysis, or the superiority and sophistication of the analysis of the other side that won or lost them that particular debate. So that's where, from the evaluation, you look at credit. So it's not enough to simply point out, oh, your argument was compelling. You need to weigh how much credit did you give to that argument, especially in cases where one side wins issue A and one side wins issue B. You need to explain why, even if Gov won issue A, why does OPSL win the debate because of issue B? So this is where you need to explain why one issue is more important than the other. So basically, my template for success is, while you want to show them that you listen to the argument, spend less time explaining what they argued and more time evaluating what they argued, and explaining the credit that you gave towards what they argued. Because at the end of the day, if it's unclear at what area they were not enough in, or what area they were edged out, they're not going to give you a high score, and they're not going to be able to understand how it occurs. So if you look at the next slide, the three features of a good oral adjudication is fairness. You want to be fair. And sometimes, even if you are fair, but if you don't come across as fair, that's bad. So this is where you don't want to sound like you're just going through the winner's case line and showing why op wasn't enough. You want to always seem balanced. You also don't want to sound like you're just regurgitating the whip speech or the reply speech of one side. So fairness means your discussion needs to be balanced. And one of the things that separate intermediate judges from advanced judges is critiquing the winner. I think that's also important, because sometimes judges tend to speak as if it's only the losing team that did something wrong. Sometimes you also need to critique what the winning team did wrong, because sometimes you're not doing this to console the losing team, although that does help, because the losing team likes judges that they're able to appreciate those particular things. Because sometimes losing teams are like, why did I lose that round? the other team had this mistake and this mistake. So it's important to acknowledge all those flaws. You need to be fair. The second is authority. So some judges might be more informal and might give their OA like a conversation. Other judges might be formal, like and be very authoritative. The point is, you want to seem like you are convinced of your decision, and you want to exude the aura that you were the person who had to listen through all these speeches, and that you have an authoritative decision on how it's going to work. Lastly is clarity. If you are vague, they won't really score you well. It's important to be clear. In the same way that debaters need to be clear to judges, they need to understand why they lost. You don't need to explain what they you don't need to explain what they should have done to win. It's enough to show why the missing piece of analysis is why they lost that particular debate. Suggestions are a double-edged sword. In some instances, it can help console the teams on what the debate should have happened, but also in other instances, debaters might feel like you're stepping into the debate. So use those with caution. So a bad oral adjudication is one that appears biased. So this is where it's clear that you only favor one team. You don't look at the flaws of another team. The discussion is based on one case line or one issue, or there's some contribution that isn't discussed. Even if contribution is something that wasn't relevant to the motion, if they spent a lot of time on it, you need to explain why it wasn't relevant to the motion. As much as possible, within those 10 minutes, you want to be comprehensive. The next quality is if you're vague or if you're distrustworthy. In general, bad oral adjudication is marked by the fact that either they can't understand it or they do understand it, but it's presented in a way where it's obviously biased or skewed. Obviously, an oral adjudication will be towards a conclusion that one side will win, but you want to present it in a way that it's objective, that you're using standards, that you're applying standards. That's another thing, by the way. In the template earlier of argument, evaluation, and credit, in evaluation, what you're using are the standards. Was there a logical gap? Was there analysis that was missing from the argument? Was the response quite compelling? Those are the things you need to use. Standards aren't just things you say at the start of the speech and then stop talking about. You use those standards and mechanize why their particular argument won or lost. So that's the third and final step. So essentially, the general structure should be you give speaker comments. So the first part is speaker comments. This is when you have general comments, not speaker comments, general comments. So what did you think of the debate? One or two would suffice in terms of the quality of the debate. What do you think both teams were guilty of? It's not necessarily something negative. Sometimes you can praise teams in terms of what they did well. Then you move on to decision. I suggest giving the decision outright. Many debaters don't like those judges who give the decision at the end. Although it might build suspense, it might make it more dramatic. It's just going to put debaters in agony, and it'll be easier if they know the conclusion so that they understand how the issues are building. And you need to be clear in terms of issues. In instances where you have judges or if you have teams winning one issue or the other, there needs to be meticulous and a substantial explanation for why one issue wins over the other. Then you conclude the speech. How do you determine whether it should be a personal comment or whether it should be in your oral adjudication? If it's how an individual speaker can improve or how an individual speaker wasn't good in that round, then that's a speaker comment. If it's material in terms of affecting the decision, then that should be in the oral adjudication. So the last part of this particular lecture, before we move on to Q&As, is chairs, panelists, and dissents. So this is really important, especially in terms of BP and Asians. So as much as possible, if you notice, I didn't discuss extensions because I was told this lecture is for Asian parliamentary. So judging BP is completely different. We can talk about that a bit later if someone wants to ask that. But in general, for chairs, panelists, and dissents, if you're a chair in the round, if you're solo, then congratulations, proceed as normal. You just have to listen, decide, deliver. But if you are with the panel, in Asians, you just need to decide as well and vote. So there's no real difference between being a chair in a panel. particularly in Asians, because you're just voting. But if you're a dissent, um, number one, in terms of a dissent, don't panic. Just because you are outruled or outvoted by the majority doesn't mean that your decision isn't correct. It's really possible that you just have different edge values or saw arguments in a different way. In instances where you're a dissent, my recommendation is you always need to be clear and you always need to be convinced, because if you're a dissenting judge, the team that eventually lost the round won't be your issue. Your issue will be the team that eventually won the round, but for you, you made them lose. So it's very important to explain how you saw the debate clearly, and you need to explain what particular gap. In that instance, as a dissenting judge, I would focus on why you think the winning team didn't win. And if you feel like you understand why the other judges voted a particular way, or you understand what the losing team's path to victory was, you need to explain why it wasn't successfully executed in your eyes, or how that's necessarily going to occur. So another thing that another unique scenario you want to talk about is definitional challenge debates. So it's really messy, and honestly, there's nothing there that you can't get from the world's manual. But in general, when there's a definitional challenge, firstly, it needs to be explicit. So leader of opposition needs to say, I am challenging the definition, and they provide another definition. From there, you need to assess whether which definition you necessarily accept. Is it the prime minister's definition or leader of the opposition's definition? And in those instances, you need to judge the debate based on the definition that was accepted. In instances where the definition is unclear or it's just elbowing, like the leader of opposition isn't challenging the definition per se, but they're providing a different frame. Firstly, try to look if arguments work on both frames or both definitions. If they do, then there really is no issue. But in instances where it clashes, you want to still go with the government definition, because technically it wasn't challenged and it wasn't something that was disputed in that particular debate. So I think that's pretty much it. Again, this is a lot of judging is really learned through experience. It's really learned through watching around. But I think at least what you should get from this lecture is how to deliver a particular oral adjudication and what you want to necessarily avoid. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them now. So one common question probably is, how would you necessarily try to apply, if there are different characterizations that are being given, how would you necessarily resolve which characterization should be applied in a particular debate? So in this case, you need to assess whether or not there was proof behind it, whether it's factual, a trend analysis, proof, grounding in terms of examples, or whether it's hypothetical, if they just simply gave a hypothetical example, whether the logic behind it makes it true. That's something you will need to assess in determining whether or not the characterization is going to be one that you accept in the round and one that you apply. So yeah, are there any questions? So yeah, you can just look at the PowerPoint, but yeah, most of the PowerPoint is really here. And if you guys need any tips for like adjudication resources, I really recommend the World's 2019 Judging Manual. Although it's for BP, it can be applied for Asians. Okay, we have a question. How do we best resolve deadlocks? So what is a deadlock? So a deadlock, as much as possible, although it's become a gimmick to say there's a deadlock, deadlocks are when both sides have conflicting claims. Like there's claim Gov is arguing this, Op is arguing the exact opposite, and the level analysis on both sides is the same. In those instances, firstly, you try to resolve the deadlock because almost always the deadlock isn't a real deadlock. There will always be one side that gave a little bit more analysis, a little bit more proof or explanation for why their particular thing is true. In instances where the deadlock cannot be resolved, i.e., both sides have equally plausible arguments, you need to look at the bigger picture or the bigger argument and the bigger issue. Which side is reliant on that particular premise? Because if one side's argument still stands, this whether notwithstanding the issue in deadlock, then that side would progress over another side. So basically, firstly, resolve the deadlock. There will always be one team that has more analysis, and therefore that their claim needs to be accepted. But in instances where there is a true deadlock, you need to look at how much does that deadlock affect the bigger picture, the bigger issues. Because if one side is relying on a premise that they didn't prove versus the other side where the premise that's in deadlock isn't really going to destabilize their case, then you go with the other side. So basically, try to resolve the deadlock, but secondly, you go beyond the deadlock and look at other areas in terms of how reliant they are to the premise that's the deadlock, because more often than not, they will have other contributions. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Iverson. If there are any other questions, feel free to type them now. I know some of you might have not caught up to the live point of the stream, so yeah. Okay, we have a question. Hi, how do we deal with an op team whose clash is somehow soft, but was still able to analyze their arguments well? So just because the clash is not ideal, just because it's soft, doesn't necessarily mean you discredit the arguments. So my recommendation would be you still look at the value of the arguments. So again, just because you had the conception of the debate or the stance of the debate, so the stance of the debate would be something that's necessarily different. Like you were expecting a harder clash, but they only gave this particular clash. You still take the arguments as is. So we don't penalize as much as possible. We don't penalize opposition teams just because the LO said this was their clash and was quite soft if their arguments are still persuasive. So to answer your question, Jules, if there's a soft clash, you still look at the arguments because the softness of that clash will only affect how persuasive the arguments are in terms of relevancy. Because if you have soft arguments that soft clash, then some of your arguments will be concedable. And so you also look at the responses of Gov to that. So I hope I was able to answer your question, Jules. We have a question. Are there differences in judging between contentious top rooms and bubbles and other rooms? If so, what tips would you have to not be overwhelmed? Okay, so whenever I judge top rooms and bubble rooms, the mindset always needs to be that this is like any other round. It's only that there are higher stakes. So what you want to do here is you want to take the extra time, especially in bubble rooms or top rooms. They will give you a little more leeway in terms of how much time that you have. But more importantly, in explaining, you need to be as comprehensive and as detailed as possible. Because the more complicated or the more contentious the room, whether it's a top room with sophisticated arguments or a bubble room where the skill level of the teams is quite close to each other, the more detailed the adjudication needs to be. So I'll assume that these rooms aren't clear victories. So in breaking or resolving those issues or resolving those points of clash, my recommendation, Rafi, or to everyone is you need to give multiple reasons for why an argument wasn't compelling or why the response was able to take down an argument. Because as much as possible in these kinds of rooms, they will be very emotional. Do not panic, but they will be very emotional. There are times where teams will cry, especially in bubble rooms, and when you're the executioner, you will have to kill some people's dreams. They will be very emotional. So the way you need to approach it is firstly logical. You need to sound very logical, but secondly is you need to give layered reasons for why they lost or why they won. Again, the approach is always, I wanted to make you win, but I couldn't because of this. That's the approach that you want to come across as, in terms of you had the tools or you could have won, but without this piece of analysis, it would be unfair for me to give you the win. So again, it always needs to goes back to what they did wrong or what they could have done better versus you stepping in. So my recommendation is for those kinds of rooms, you necessarily want to not panic and try to give layered reasons and always draw it back to what was lacking or what existed in their contribution. We have another question. Oh, we have a follow up from Jules. For example, in the motion, this House believes that X country should sanction the Philippines for extrajudicial killings. Op stance is we would for Y country. So it concedes the plan of action, but it deals with another actor. If God does not call out the softness of their stance, can we intervene as an average reasonable persons or not? So in those instances, Jules, you wouldn't. So basically, let's say this house as blank. So basically, Gov is, let's assume one is the US, the other is France. The fact that they concede that someone should sanction makes the debate smaller in the sense that it's now a discussion of which country should do it. So you don't need to intervene because Gov and Op need to adapt to that debate and still respond to why country A or country B would be the better country. So while it might concede one part of the motion, the fact that they're saying another country should do it doesn't mean that they necessarily lose the debate. So if I were you, I would still judge the debate would be smaller, but it's still a debatable debate. So there's no need to intervene. And I recommend not intervening. And I think Gov will call out how there are principal differences. So it'll really be up to whether Op can justify why their country is the better country to be able to do this or to call out the Philippines for those particular instances. So Jules, in that scenario, while the clash is soft and it leaves little room for the debate, you still need to take the arguments as is. So we have a question from Miguel Sulet. What do you think of judges breaking deadlocks based on speaker rules? I don't really think speaker rules is a fair criteria to break deadlocks. I don't understand why a whip would be any different from a deputy. I don't think just because it came earlier in the debate, it definitely wins. Perhaps the only instance where that might occur or where that might be true is if the material only came out from whip. So if it's new matter. But obviously if it's a response, then it's not going to be new matter. So perhaps if it came out in reply, that's a way where you could say that it was new matter and speaker rules does come into consideration. But generally, Miguel Sulet, I would say that in resolving deadlocks, I don't think it's based on speaker rules. It's really based on the amount of analysis that was put into proving their claim. And in instances where the deadlock still exists, how crucial was that premise to their particular case? So I hope that answered your question. Oh, there was a follow-up to that, which was, have heard from judges in tournaments, if there's a deadlock between Gov Whip and Op Whip on an issue, Op has a higher responsive burden as the latter team. That's not true. In those instances, just because Op Whip had to respond to Gov Whip, high responsive burden doesn't really make sense. Because if Op Whip agrees, if Op Whip's analysis was more compelling than Gov Whip, then there's no deadlock. Then Op should have won. So I don't think that you put a premium on who speaks last. It's more of could they respond to it. So I think it'll only come into play if it's really new matter. So I hope that answers your question. We have another question. How do you deal with principle versus pragmatic debates? Like one side is mostly principle, the other side is mostly impacts. So firstly, there's no such thing. There's no difference between a principle or pragmatic, or the conception that I think what those debates will look like is one side is there's so many benefits or so many harms to this. I think the perfect example of this is one side will be there's so many harms to this. So impacts. But one side is like, but these are the values. We have a duty or a moral obligation to do it despite those harms. In those instances, you're looking at trade-offs. So that's another thing judges can use in trying to resolve principled versus pragmatic debates, look at trade-offs, because teams will have to justify those impacts or justify that principle. So look at which team was able to explain why they were willing to sacrifice one for another. So in those instances, it's not that you're going to say, because in those instances, then you need to craft the issue, pitting those two things together. Don't have a principled issue and a pragmatic issue. Have the issue so that it's pointed towards were they able to justify absorbing these particular things. So if the principal team won, you explain why the principle of absorbing all of these pragmatic harms was justified, or if the pragmatic team won, then the pragmatic team would still have a principle that all these things in terms of utilitarianism is wrong. So I hope that makes sense. So essentially, in principled versus pragmatic debates, pragmatics will have a principle, which is utilitarianism. So what you want to necessarily do is you pit those two together in how you frame your issue. Okay, so I hope that helps your question. That answers your question. In note taking, how do you organize or write ideas presented in debate along your personal evaluation of the match? So it really varies. For me, I like to use multicolored pens, and what they do is, if I have a piece of paper, I'll try to put speaker comments at the end or at the bottom of the page, so that speaker comments are separated, because they're basically like time management or things the speaker could have done wrong. What you want to do is you want to necessarily put questions or evaluations within the speech. So for me personally, if I write an argument but didn't explain how, I might write the word how or no explanation for how this is going to occur. So Generic, one of my recommendations is have a designated portion for speaker comments, and you can also write in a different colored pen or a different, or your call, or you can encircle it or in a different section. If you can put the argument itself and your questions or comments on the argument. We have a question from Joey. How do I judge when people keep being inconsistent? So again, if people are constantly changing their strategies or changing their claims, firstly, analyze, is the inconsistency significant? Does it compromise your understanding of the argument? What World's adjudication course and UADC adjudication course have said is you disregard latter statements. You only accept the first statement that was said. If there are two claims that are contradictory, you only accept the first statement. And in instances where one team is quite inconsistent, that means that they're wasting a lot of airtime because you're disregarding contradictory material. So that's something you need to take into consideration. But again, just because a team might be shifting claims all the time doesn't mean they automatically lose. What I would say is take the first statement and disregard the other statements. If they're being inconsistent with their values, then that might detract from their persuasiveness. So you also need to evaluate the responses to those inconsistencies. But even without responses, you should be able to evaluate inconsistency and credit it accordingly. So I hope that answers your question, Christian. We have a question from Chris. What are practices or exercises you can do at home to improve in judging and delivering OAs? One thing would be try to judge debates. So find a debate without looking at the decision and try to judge that debate at home and decide and see if it matches up with how the debate turned out. So that's one recommendation I would do. Another would be, in terms of really doing it at home, it would really just be judging debates, because the best way to become a better judge is really experience and really trying to judge a debate. Another thing you can do at home is that particular instance, it's not just, oh, does your decision match? It's also you're doing other things, such as getting down your note-taking technique. So when you're judging a debate at home, even if you won't be able to deliver an OA to real people, you'll be able to master down your note-taking technique. And the fact that you were able to have a good grasp of the debate, comprehending a debate and comprehending why a decision is likely to be true, that's already one thing. Second thing is you can have like Zoom debates or Facebook Live debates or whatever kind of medium you want to use and try to give OAs to other people. Even if you don't have enough members for a full round, even if it's just prime minister, leader of opposition, the fact that you're able to weigh speeches and give them an oral adjudication will help. So basically, if you're at home, my recommendation would be to watch recorded debates without looking at the decision and try to both focus on your listening technique and your note taking technique, but also your deciding technique. So yeah, any more questions? Thank you guys. Uh, I hope that answered your question, Chris. How do you credit PUIs? So PUI should be treated as any other material. So you should listen to them, and you should if it's a rebuttal, then you need to credit that rebuttal. If it's a statement that might have argumentative value, you need to credit that as well. If it's a question that reveals, if it's a question, then you evaluate the response to that question and how it affects the debate. Like if it highlights an inconsistency, if it puts government or opposition in a place where they don't have the answer, which means there's a shortcoming in their model or their frame. Essentially is you treat a POI as any other material, and you treat, if it's a declarative statement, you treat it as part of their contribution. If it's a question, you look at the response and you treat it as all the other things. So POIs can win debates. A really good POI, whether it's a rebuttal POI or an important question that a bad answer to reveals a shortcoming in the case, they can really win or lose debates. Oh, that's another thing. Replies are very important. I know Papa just had a lecture on POIs and replies. Replies are important. You need to listen to them. Common mistake is replies only matter in close debates. That's wrong. Even in debates where there's a huge margin, you need to listen to replies because one, they can lessen the margin, but two, replies can reframe how you think of the debate. So even if you think one side already won, a good reply can reframe how you look at particular issues and can also win them the debate. So while there's not new material in replies, the fact that they can reframe and analyze the debate might provide you a perspective to win. So POIs and replies need to be credited in how they add contribution, or in case of replies, how they reframe existing contribution. So I hope that answers your question, Jules. So yeah, if there are no more questions, feel free to, you can just comment, and then I'll try to answer them later. I guess I'll wait like 2 more minutes, perhaps there are additional questions. But yeah, so that's how you judge. So judging is really, on a parting note, a lot of people think that judging isn't that fun. I disagree. Judging is fun because you're basically debating as well, but you're trying to convince 8 people why they won or lost the debate. 8 or 6 people why they won or lost the debate. But also towards the end of your career, or even if you're just starting out, judging will really help you because once you're on the other side of things, you'll know how to improve your argumentation. You'll know what judges are looking for. Sometimes, like the first time I judged, I think I was a freshman, and after judging, I realized the common mistakes of debaters, and I also realized things I need to work on. So judging is really a good thing for anyone to do. And towards the end of your debate career, judging is really a valuable skill, because if you do really well, then you're going to be judging in tournaments, and you might even be an invited or a subsidized adjudicator. So judging is a really important skill, not just because it helps you become a better debater, but it also helps. It's also a skill in itself. Judging is something that warrants equal respect as a sport or as an activity with debating. So yeah, you're welcome, guys. No problem. Hope this helped. If you guys have any questions, feel free to just comment. As an Adj, how should I deal with debates who can't accept my decision during personal comments when being harassed? Okay, so this is a good question. As much as possible, firstly, you wanted to avoid that scenario. You want to make sure that your oral adjudication is clear and authoritative as possible, that people will understand why you got to that point. But I understand there's some debaters who are really just don't like losing. So in those instances, if they can't accept your decision, firstly, stay calm. Don't raise your voice. Stay calm. As a judge, never raise your voice. Um, Firstly, make sure that they submit the score before you give personal comments. But secondly, you want to be logical, be objective, be calm, and you explain to them your side of things. If they disagree with them, then you can end the conversation. If they disagree, you can continue explaining or answering any questions they have. But after that, if they still say they disagree, there's really nothing you can do. So you just end the conversation. If they're harassing you, you can end the conversation and report it to the nearest orgcom member or the AdCorp member, because debaters shouldn't be harassing you. You're also a human being. You're also a participant in the tournament. So if they're harassing you, what I would do is I would just, one, try to explain if they have any questions, and if they still disagree and they're trying to harass me, I would just end the conversation. I would say, I respectfully disagree. That's how I saw the debate. That's not how I saw the debate. Yeah, because the decision's already final. So what else can they do? A lot of sometimes when they're harassing you, they're just trying to vent their emotions, which is incorrect, by the way. You're not supposed to express your emotions that particular way. But sometimes it's more of them wanting to express their feelings more than they're angry at you. So one, don't take it personally. But for me, just be objective. So I hope that answers your question, Rimari. I guess I'll wait one more minute because there was a follow-up question. But yeah. Okay. Thank you, guys.